Only one of them isn't pretending. Look at the red doll. A security camera shows a room filled with dolls. At night, they start moving. Some cry, some laugh. All of them slowly turn their heads. But one doll never moves. The red one. It just sits still, smiling. And somehow, every other doll moves when it does. As if one doll is controlling all the others. If this was in your home, would you try to find it or destroy them all?
This is a true horror story about something I recorded at exactly 3:14 a.m., and I wish I never watched it. Living alone in a sprawling, deeply isolated, slightly outdated craftsman house located at the very end of a heavily wooded, dead-end road in the rural outskirts of the Pacific Northwest gives you a profound, almost oppressive appreciation for absolute, unbroken silence. The dense, towering acres of ancient pine trees that completely surround my property act as a massive, natural, impenetrable barrier that effectively swallows any ambient noise from the distant, winding highway. I have always been a naturally solitary, deeply introverted person, and I genuinely used to find a profound, deeply comforting sense of peace in the absolute isolation of my remote home, especially during the late, quiet, uninterrupted hours of the night. I have never been a superstitious man, and I certainly never spent my dark evenings actively searching the internet for a fictional scary story to give myself a fleeting, entertaining thrill. I always preferred logic, rational explanations, and tangible, historical facts. That deeply ingrained pragmatism is exactly why I began my highly specific, admittedly eccentric hobby. Over the course of the last 15 years, I have meticulously acquired, carefully restored, and proudly displayed antique porcelain figures. I had completely transformed the largest spare bedroom at the absolute end of my long, dark, second-floor hallway into a dedicated, temperature-controlled exhibition space for over 60 vintage, historically significant pieces. To the average, unaccustomed observer, walking into a silent, dimly lit room entirely filled with dozens of glass-eyed, unblinking faces staring blankly from towering wooden shelves and locked glass cabinets might immediately invoke deep, instinctual, terrifying thoughts of haunted dolls and dark, supernatural attachments. But to my rational mind, they were simply fragile, beautiful, perfectly preserved fragments of forgotten history. However, a comfortable, quiet isolation is an incredibly fragile, delicate illusion, relying entirely on the firm, unshakable belief that you are completely alone in the dark. When the impenetrable walls of your private sanctuary are quietly and inexplicably breached in the dead of the freezing night, your logical foundation violently crumbles, leaving you completely trapped in a terrifying real experience that permanently and irreparably shatters your core understanding of the natural, safe world. The deeply unsettling, creeping anomalies began slowly, subtly invading the quiet, mundane routine of my isolated life late last November. I would frequently walk past the closed, heavy solid oak door of the collection room and immediately feel a sudden, intense, highly unnatural drop in the ambient barometric pressure, accompanied by a bitter, biting chill that completely bypassed the central heating system and sank directly into the marrow of my freezing bones. Occasionally, in the dead, heavily pressurized silence of the early morning hours, as I lay perfectly still in my master bedroom just down the corridor, I would faintly, undeniably hear the distinct, microscopic, highly unnatural sound of old, dry wood gently creaking. It sounded exactly as if a heavy, localized, physical weight was carefully, methodically shifting across the polished hardwood floorboards of that specific, locked room. My rational, desperate brain violently tried to dismiss these creeping, unsettling occurrences as the natural, structural settling of a decades-old house completely exposed to the freezing, biting winter wind sweeping down from the mountain range. But the heavy, psychological pressure of feeling intensely, malevolently watched every single time I turned my vulnerable, exposed back to that closed wooden door eventually became far too immense, far too crushing to simply ignore. I decided to rely entirely on modern, infallible technology to definitively prove to my exhausted, rapidly fracturing mind that my house was entirely empty, perfectly secure, and completely devoid of any impossible anomalies. I purchased a high-definition, motion-activated, infrared night vision security camera and firmly, meticulously mounted it in the uppermost, shadowed corner of the collection room. I carefully angled the wide, unblinking lens downward to perfectly capture the entire expanse of the long wooden display shelves, the locked antique glass cabinets, and the heavy oak door, ensuring there were absolutely no blind spots in the pitch-black space. I desperately wanted to capture a mundane, completely uneventful video that would permanently silence the screaming, primal survival instincts endlessly echoing in my exhausted brain. I had absolutely no idea that I was about to inadvertently create a deeply disturbing, creepy recording that would completely, permanently destroy my fragile sanity. The specific night I finally activated the small, black camera was bitterly cold and completely, uncharacteristically windless. I firmly locked the heavy brass deadbolt on the front door, carefully armed the glowing digital security system in the foyer, and slowly retreated to my master bedroom, pulling my heavy winter quilts tightly around my freezing shoulders. But as the harsh, piercing red light of my digital bedside clock slowly flipped past midnight, the heavy, ambient atmosphere inside the isolated house fundamentally, violently, and irreparably shifted. The natural, comforting, ambient background noises of the old craftsman house slowly began to completely, inexplicably fade away into absolute nothingness. The low, familiar, mechanical hum of the kitchen refrigerator compressor abruptly and violently cut out. The rhythmic, gentle, natural settling creaks of the wooden walls completely ceased. Even the faint, distant, rushing sound of the late-night highway traffic miles away was entirely swallowed by a dense, oppressive, highly unnatural void. The entire sprawling property was violently plunged into a deafening, heavy, static void of absolute, terrifying silence. It felt exactly as if the barometric air pressure in the long, dark hallway had suddenly, aggressively dropped, pressing a heavy, invisible weight against my inner eardrums and making the cold, stagnant air feel impossibly thick and incredibly difficult to breathe. I lay perfectly, rigidly still under my heavy blankets, my wide, burning, dry eye staring blankly at the pitch-black plaster ceiling, my heart beginning to beat with a frantic, uneven, heavy rhythm against my tight ribs exactly like a trapped, panicked bird. I couldn't explain it. There was absolutely no logical, rational reason for the sudden, massive spike of primal, unadulterated anxiety aggressively washing over my completely exhausted body, but I felt an intense, undeniable, deeply physical sensation pressing heavily against the stagnant air. It was the absolute, highly paralyzing certainty that something was fundamentally, deeply wrong. The dark, isolated house felt incredibly hostile, actively pressing inward exactly like a closing tomb. I felt an intense, overwhelming, and highly unnatural presence radiating violently straight through the solid drywall separating my bedroom from the dark hallway. It was the undeniable, physical, terrifying sensation of an unseen, unblinking gaze meticulously tracking my exact, terrified stillness from the pitch-black shadows just outside my door. I absolutely did not dare to get out of my warm bed. I entirely refused to walk down the freezing, dark corridor to check on the closed, heavy oak door of the collection room. I simply lay there, forcefully clamping my pale lips tightly shut and holding my breath so intensely that my tight, cramping lungs violently burned. I was completely, helplessly trapped in a single, infinite, agonizing standoff that stretched endless, terrifying seconds into suffocating, exhausting hours of pure psychological torture. I desperately prayed to whatever ancient god was listening that the small, blinking green light of the security camera in the other room was capturing absolutely nothing but empty, static darkness. When the pale, cold, grey light of the early morning sun finally broke through the dense, creeping winter fog and slowly illuminated my freezing bedroom, a massive, overwhelming wave of disorienting relief washed over my exhausted, sleep-deprived body. The heavy, plunging barometric pressure had finally lifted, the intense, freezing cold had slowly receded from the stagnant air, and the ambient, comforting sounds of the quiet neighborhood had gradually returned, signaling that the deep, pitch-black night was finally over. I practically sprinted out of my bed, my bare feet sinking into the freezing, polished hardwood floorboards, and walked directly down the long, narrow hallway to the collection room. I grasped the cold brass handle, forcefully turned it, and pushed the heavy oak door wide open. The room looked perfectly, flawlessly normal, exactly as I had left it. The dozens of pale, porcelain faces stared blankly and silently back at me from their designated, meticulous positions on the dusty wooden shelves. The heavy glass cabinets remained securely, perfectly locked. My rational, logical mind instantly celebrated, fully convinced that the heavy, suffocating terror of the previous night had simply been a highly vivid, temporary hallucination brought on by severe exhaustion and a lingering, irrational fear of the dark. I reached up into the shadowed corner, carefully unmounted the small black camera, pulled the tiny, fragile SD card from its plastic slot, and walked quickly back to the warm comfort of my home office. I inserted the tiny memory card into my desktop computer, brought up the digital video player, and began to quickly, impatiently scrub through the long hours of captured night vision footage, fully expecting to find a deeply boring, uneventful video. For the first 3 hours, the green-tinted video was incredibly mundane, completely static, and entirely devoid of any physical movement whatsoever. The digital timestamp in the bottom right corner of the glowing screen ticked silently and steadily forward, 12 a.m., 1:15 a.m., 2:30 a.m. I watched the stationary, highly detailed, green-tinted visual of the silent dolls sitting perfectly still on their wooden shelves, completely satisfied that my ridiculous, paranoid fears were entirely unfounded and that the bizarre idea of haunted dolls actively moving in the dark was nothing more than a fabricated scary story used to frighten children. I was just about to confidently close the application and permanently delete the massive video file, entirely ready to move on with my quiet life. But then, I slowly decreased the playback speed to normal as the bright, digital timestamp slowly approached the 3 o'clock hour, a cold, creeping sense of primal dread suddenly pooling heavily in the very bottom of my empty stomach. That is exactly when I noticed it. The heavy, creeping realization that I was actively, helplessly watching a true horror story actively unfold on my glowing monitor instantly and violently paralyzed my freezing lungs. This was absolutely not a fictional tale, this was a terrifying real experience recorded in high definition, completely stripping away any remaining, pathetic fragments of my rational mind. As the digital number silently ticked toward exactly 3:14 a.m., the absolute, static stillness of the green-tinted room fundamentally, violently, and inexplicably shifted. The smooth, continuous digital feed began to violently, sporadically flicker, the visual data aggressively tearing and distorting in a chaotic, highly mechanical static loop. It looked exactly as if a massive, heavy, unseen source of intense electromagnetic interference was aggressively pressing heavily against the sensitive glass of the camera lens, actively corrupting the digital recording. I leaned extremely close to the glowing monitor, my clammy, sweating hands gripping the smooth edge of my wooden desk so tightly that my knuckles turned completely, painfully white. My wide, burning, unblinking eyes were locked completely onto the exact center of the flickering screen, desperately trying to pierce through the heavy, jumping digital static to see what was happening in the dark room. The violent, abrasive visual distortion lasted for exactly 12 agonizing, terrifying seconds. My heart completely stopped in my chest. When the heavily corrupted, creepy recording finally stabilized and the green-tinted visual feed violently snapped back into sharp, high-definition focus, the digital timestamp in the bottom corner locked perfectly onto exactly 3:14 a.m. I completely stopped breathing, a sharp, sickening pain violently piercing my inner eardrums. My heart skipped a violent, agonizing beat before hammering aggressively against my tight ribs exactly like a heavy sledgehammer, flooding my tired veins with a freezing shockwave of pure, toxic, blinding adrenaline. I sat completely frozen in my comfortable office chair, entirely consumed by a pure, unadulterated primal dread that violently stripped away every single rational, logical thought I possessed. This was absolutely not a visual glitch. It was not a strange, highly coincidental trick of the shifting night shadows, and it was certainly not a digital artifact caused by a faulty, cheap memory card. It was a dark, impossible reality bleeding aggressively into my quiet, mundane life. In the absolute dead center of the dark room, resting heavily on the middle wooden shelf, was a large, antique Victorian doll with long, dark, matted hair and a heavy, faded, intricately woven lace dress. When I had activated the camera the previous evening, I had meticulously, perfectly positioned her facing directly forward toward the opposite wall, her small, pale porcelain hands resting perfectly, quietly in her stiff lap, exactly where she had been sitting completely undisturbed for over 3 years. But in the cold, harsh, green-tinted glow of the security footage, frozen forever at exactly 3:14 a.m., she was no longer facing the opposite wall. Her pale, rigid, unblinking porcelain face had completely, smoothly, and impossibly rotated over 90 degrees to the left. Her dark, hollow, highly reflective glass eyes were now staring directly, intensely, and with terrifying, flawless, mathematically perfect precision straight up into the exact center of the hidden camera lens. One of the dolls is not in the same position. I thought it was just my imagination until I watched it again. I was sitting completely alone in the pitch-black darkness of my home office, the only source of illumination in the suffocating room being the harsh, pale blue glow of my computer monitor heavily reflecting against my sweating face. For the past 2 weeks, a creeping, deeply unsettling sense of dread had slowly been taking root in the very bottom of my stomach regarding the antique collection I had recently inherited and stored in the isolated guest bedroom down the hall. I had always been entirely skeptical of the supernatural, aggressively dismissing any terrifying scary story I read online as nothing more than an entertaining work of vivid fiction, but the bizarre, impossible inconsistencies I had been noticing completely shattered my rational mind. Items were inexplicably shifted, cold drafts seemed to violently radiate from closed windows, and an overwhelming, highly malevolent feeling of being intensely watched saturated the stagnant air whenever I stepped foot inside that room. Desperate to prove to my rapidly fracturing sanity that there was absolutely no such thing as a real experience involving genuine paranormal activity, I had purchased a high-definition, motion-activated night vision security camera and securely mounted it directly in the upper corner of the ceiling, pointing its wide lens entirely at the sprawling shelves of heavy, ancient porcelain figures. I had spent the entire morning convincing myself that the subtle changes in the room were simply the result of an old house naturally settling, or perhaps vibrations from heavy trucks passing on the distant highway miles away. But as my trembling hand reached out and aggressively clicked the mouse to replay the digital footage from the previous night, that comforting, fragile illusion of safety violently and permanently dissolved into pure, unadulterated primal terror. The video file began to play in total, deafening silence, the screen completely saturated in the eerie, high-contrast, sickly green hue of the infrared night vision lens. The digital timestamp glowing brightly in the bottom right corner of the frame displayed exactly 3:14 a.m. At first glance, the footage showed absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. The heavy wooden shelves stretching across the far wall were perfectly still, populated by dozens of vintage, meticulously crafted figures, their glass eyes reflecting the invisible infrared light like tiny, glowing orbs suspended in the heavy dark. I sat completely frozen in my leather desk chair, my breathing incredibly shallow, my dry eyes burning as I meticulously scanned every single pixel of the silent footage, desperately searching for a stray shadow, a passing insect, or any logical explanation for why the camera had been triggered in an entirely empty, locked room. I watched the stagnant green room for 2 full, agonizing minutes, the heavy silence of my own house pressing violently against my inner eardrums, making the frantic, uneven hammering of my own heartbeat sound deafeningly loud. I was just about to let out a long, exhausted sigh of relief and close the application, entirely ready to chalk the recording up to a simple technological glitch, when my eyes caught a microscopic, almost imperceptible anomaly in the upper left corner of the heavy wooden display shelf. But something wasn't right. I immediately paused the video, my clammy fingers slipping slightly on the plastic mouse, and violently leaned forward until my pale nose was mere inches away from the glowing glass screen. I focused entirely on a specific, highly detailed, antique Victorian doll sitting rigidly on the second shelf, a heavily weathered piece wearing a deeply faded, intricately laced black morning dress. I slowly, carefully scrubbed the digital timeline backward by 10 seconds, took a deep, trembling breath, and pressed play once again. I thought it was just my imagination, until I watched it again. In the dead, absolute silence of the recorded footage, completely devoid of any accompanying audio track to ground the reality of the situation, the Victorian doll began to move. It was not a sudden, violent jerk, and it was absolutely not the result of the heavy figure losing its balance and naturally settling onto the wooden plank. It was a smooth, flawless, deeply mechanical, and agonizingly slow rotation of its porcelain neck. The movement was incredibly, terrifyingly deliberate, the heavy, painted head gliding silently on its wooden joint with a highly unnatural, physics-defying precision that completely bypassed the immutable laws of gravity and inanimate objects. I sat completely paralyzed in the pale blue light, a massive, freezing shockwave of pure, unadulterated dread tearing straight down my spine as I watched the painted face slowly turn exactly 15 degrees to the right. There was absolutely no sound on the recording, no heavy footsteps echoing in the dark room, no unseen strings violently pulling the figure, and absolutely no visible force acting upon the heavy antique. It was moving entirely of its own dark, impossible accord. Living through a deeply disturbing real experience involving actual haunted dolls is a completely isolating, mind-shattering ordeal that instantly strips away every single rational, logical defense mechanism you possess. You are violently forced to confront the impossible, terrifying reality that the inanimate, lifeless objects you have completely ignored are somehow possessed by a dark, waking, malevolent consciousness. I desperately, pathetically tried to convince my breaking mind that it was just a strange, digital artifact, a compression error in the video file, but the terrifying clarity of the high-definition lens offered absolutely no such merciful escape. As the glowing digital timestamp continued to silently tick forward, counting the endless, terrifying seconds of the freezing night, the horrific anomalies in the locked room aggressively escalated. I was completely trapped in my chair, physically unable to look away from the glowing screen as a second, completely different figure situated on the completely opposite side of the sprawling room began to slowly, unnaturally shift its physical position. This one was a heavy, incredibly old wooden marionette resting on a small, ornate side table. Its long, jointed wooden arm, which had been resting completely limp and lifeless against its painted side, slowly, deliberately began to rise into the freezing, stagnant air. The movement was incredibly slow, a highly unnatural, creeping ascension that looked exactly as if the solid wood were moving through a dense, heavy, invisible liquid. The arm stopped exactly halfway up, the painted, wooden hand hovering menacingly in the dark, pointing directly toward the center of the locked bedroom. The overwhelming, crushing psychological pressure of watching these impossible dolls moving in the dead silence of the night was immense, an intense, physical weight that actively squeezed the precious oxygen right out of my tight, cramping lungs. I felt an intense, overwhelming, and highly unnatural presence pressing heavily against the back of my own neck right there in the office, the undeniable, highly paralyzing physical sensation of an unseen, unblinking gaze meticulously tracking my exact movements from the pitch-black shadows just outside my open door. I knew, with absolute, sickening certainty, that the terrifying paranormal activity I was actively witnessing on the glowing screen was not just contained to the digital file. The heavy, toxic energy of that locked guest room was actively bleeding out into the rest of my quiet, isolated house. The digital camera kept recording, silently capturing the dark, impossible awakening of the forgotten collection. The movements were incredibly slow, profoundly unnatural, and completely devoid of any earthly logic. Over the course of the next 15 agonizing minutes of footage, I watched in absolute, mind-numbing horror as the entire heavy display shelf seemingly came alive with dark, microscopic, highly deliberate activity. A porcelain hand twitched. A heavy glass eye rolled smoothly in its painted socket. A completely lifeless, cloth-covered leg slowly dragged itself forward an inch across the polished wood. There was absolutely no frantic, chaotic motion, no objects violently flying through the freezing air. It was a slow, creeping, meticulously orchestrated, highly predatory display of ancient patience. They were waking up, testing their heavy, rigid joints in the suffocating dark, entirely aware that the heavy, secure door was locked and they were completely alone in the isolated room. Every single, microscopic movement was a terrifying, undeniable confirmation that my home was deeply, fundamentally infested by something ancient and thoroughly malevolent. The chilling realization that I had been sleeping deeply and peacefully just down the hallway while this terrifying, silent symphony of unnatural movement was taking place completely broke my remaining sanity. I desperately wanted to violently rip the power cord out of the wall, to completely plunge the glowing monitor into absolute darkness, and run blindly out of the front door into the freezing, bitter night, but I was completely, helplessly anchored to the desk by a heavy, hypnotic, invasive compulsion to see exactly how the terrifying recording ended. I slowly, with a violently trembling, sweating hand, reached out and grabbed the plastic mouse, dragging the video progress bar quickly forward toward the very end of the massive digital file. I skipped over 2 full hours of silent, dark, agonizingly slow creeping movements, the timestamp rapidly blurring as the digital numbers aggressively fast-forwarded to exactly 5:33 a.m., just mere moments before the pale, early morning light would begin to filter through the heavy window blinds. The screen froze for a fraction of a single, highly pressurized second as the software buffered the heavy data, and when the glowing image finally, sharply stabilized in the eerie green light, my heart completely stopped dead in my chest. The sprawling, heavy wooden display shelves were no longer populated by a random, disorganized collection of vintage, lifeless figures staring blankly into the empty spaces of the room. The agonizingly slow, creeping, unnatural movements I had watched earlier were not just random, mindless twitches of dark energy, they had been highly deliberate, meticulously calculated repositionings. I stared in absolute, mind-shattering horror at the glowing green monitor, the freezing air in my home office suddenly feeling impossibly heavy and thick to breathe. I didn't need to check the locked door down the hallway to know that my house was no longer safe. I didn't need to hear a single sound to know that I was in terrible, immediate danger. The final, terrifying frame of the silent footage permanently burned itself into my exhausted, breaking mind. All the dolls are facing the camera now. The moment I realized they were looking at me, I knew I made a mistake. What had begun as a terrifying, creeping suspicion in the dead of the night had rapidly and violently mutated into a true horror story actively unfolding directly on my glowing computer monitor. I had spent countless, meticulous hours over the past 15 years carefully curating this specific antique collection, confidently and rationally believing they were simply fragile, lifeless artifacts of forgotten history, but watching the silent, green-tinted security footage completely and permanently shattered that naive, comforting illusion. The agonizingly slow, deeply mechanical movements I had witnessed in the locked, freezing guest room were absolutely no longer random, mindless twitches of residual paranormal energy. They were completely, terrifyingly focused. All the dolls, dozens of pale, rigid porcelain faces and unblinking, highly reflective glass eyes, had simultaneously and perfectly rotated their heavy, painted necks to stare directly into the hidden camera lens mounted in the upper corner of the ceiling. But as I sat completely frozen in my home office, my trembling hands slick with cold sweat and my tight lungs burning for precious oxygen, a freezing, sickening realization washed violently over my exhausted body. They weren't just staring blindly at the small, black plastic casing of the digital camera. Through some dark, impossible, highly predatory supernatural connection, they were looking directly at me, sitting entirely alone in the pitch-black darkness down the long, narrow hallway. It was a terrifying, undeniable confirmation of severe paranormal activity that permanently poisoned the quiet, isolated sanctuary of my home. I desperately, forcefully slammed my laptop shut, the loud, sharp crack of the heavy plastic echoing violently in the heavily pressurized, dead silence of the house, but the suffocating, crushing feeling of that collective, unblinking gaze absolutely did not fade. In fact, it aggressively and rapidly escalated, bleeding out of the digital recording and saturating the stagnant air of the entire property. I couldn't sleep a single second that night, entirely consumed by the pure, unadulterated primal dread that firmly anchored my freezing body to my mattress. But the true, mind-breaking terror did not magically vanish when the pale, cold, grey light of the early morning sun finally broke through the dense, unseasonable winter fog. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere of the pitch-black night began to aggressively, relentlessly bleed into the bright daylight hours. I started feeling that intense, highly malevolent presence pressing heavily against my spine even during the bright, bustling hours of the afternoon. Whether I was standing perfectly still in the sunlit kitchen, slowly brewing a cup of black coffee, or sitting comfortably in the living room attempting to read a heavy novel, the heavy, static sensation of something watching me was completely, suffocatingly constant. It was the undeniable, highly paralyzing physical sensation of an unseen, unblinking gaze meticulously tracking my exact, terrified movements from the deep, pitch-black corners of the house, completely ignoring the comforting warmth of the daylight. I could no longer walk past the closed, solid oak door of the collection room without my heart hammering aggressively against my tight ribs exactly like a trapped, panicked bird, completely terrified that the heavy door would suddenly, violently swing open on its own. The entire sprawling craftsman house felt incredibly hostile, actively pressing inward exactly like a closing, wooden tomb. The boundary between a simple, fabricated scary story and a deeply traumatizing real experience had completely and violently dissolved, leaving me entirely trapped in a waking, suffocating nightmare that I could not escape. I knew, with absolute, world-shattering certainty, that the heavy, toxic energy saturating my home was growing significantly stronger, vastly heavier, and terrifyingly more aggressive with every single passing hour. Desperate to understand the full, horrifying scope of the paranormal infestation, I decided I needed more concrete, undeniable video evidence to ground my rapidly fracturing sanity. I desperately tried to convince myself that the haunted dolls were simply localized to that specific, temperature-controlled room, completely contained behind the heavy brass deadbolt. I rationalized that if I could just prove that the rest of the isolated house was completely empty and devoid of any dark anomalies, I could slowly, carefully regain control of my breaking mind. The following evening, completely ignoring the primal survival instincts violently screaming in the back of my brain, I meticulously set up a second motion-activated, high-definition infrared security camera. But this time, I securely mounted it directly on the tall wooden bookshelf in my home office, angling the wide, unblinking lens downward to perfectly capture my heavy leather desk chair, my computer monitor, and the open doorway leading directly out into the dark, central hallway. I wanted to record the empty office while I slept down the hall, desperate to definitively prove that the oppressive, heavy feeling of being intensely watched was simply a byproduct of my severe sleep deprivation and extreme paranoia. That night, I firmly locked my master bedroom door, curled into a tight, violently trembling ball under my heavy winter quilts, and suffered through another agonizing, endless night of heavy, dead, pressurized silence. When the pale morning light finally arrived, I practically sprinted into the office, my bare feet sinking painfully into the freezing, polished hardwood floorboards, and aggressively pulled the tiny SD card from the newly mounted camera. I inserted it into my desktop computer, my breath forming thick, rapid white clouds of condensation in the freezing indoor air, and immediately opened the digital video player. I scrubbed quickly and impatiently through the first few hours of green-tinted, completely static footage, the digital timestamp rapidly ticking past midnight and into the early morning. The office was perfectly still, entirely devoid of any physical movement, the heavy leather chair sitting completely empty in the center of the frame. I let out a long, quiet, exhausted sigh of relief, my tight, cramping lungs finally taking in a deep, natural breath, desperately wanting to believe that the terrifying ordeal was entirely contained to the other room. But as the bright digital numbers silently approached the 3 o'clock hour, the smooth, continuous digital feed began to violently, sporadically flicker. The sickly green visual data aggressively tore and distorted in a chaotic, highly mechanical static loop, exactly identical to the intense, localized electromagnetic interference I had witnessed on the very first creepy recording. The violent, abrasive visual distortion lasted for several agonizing, terrifying seconds, my frantic heartbeat completely stopping dead in my chest. When the heavily corrupted footage finally stabilized and the green-tinted visual violently snapped back into sharp, high-definition focus, the digital timestamp in the bottom right corner locked perfectly onto exactly 3:14 a.m. I leaned extremely close to the glowing monitor, my dry, burning eyes meticulously scanning the illuminated frame, fully expecting to see a dark shadow creeping down the hallway or perhaps one of the antique porcelain dolls standing impossibly in the open doorway. But the terrifying final reveal was infinitely worse than my darkest, most panicked nightmares. The camera shows something else entirely. It wasn't just a physical manifestation of haunted dolls actively moving in the dark. The wide, unblinking lens perfectly captured my empty leather desk chair, but the heavy, suffocating shadows pooling densely in the corner of the room directly behind the desk were completely, fundamentally wrong. Standing perfectly, terrifyingly still in the absolute dead center of the frame, towering directly over the empty chair where I currently sat, was a figure. It was incredibly, impossibly tall, its physical proportions heavily obscured by the pitch-black, suffocating void that actively absorbed the invisible infrared light of the camera. It absolutely did not look like a normal human being, and it certainly was not one of the small, porcelain figures from the locked room down the hall. It looked exactly like a massive, three-dimensional tear in the fabric of the dark night, a heavy, highly concentrated mass of pure, unadulterated darkness. Its impossibly long, shadowy arms hung completely limp and lifeless at its sides, ending in deeply tapered, shifting, ink-like points that seemed to actively bleed into the surrounding air. It was completely featureless, entirely devoid of a human face or reflective eyes, but its massive, heavy head was tilted sharply downward, staring intensely at the empty leather chair with a horrifying, ancient malice. The creeping, sickening realization violently slammed into my chest like a heavy sledgehammer, completely destroying the final, fragile remnants of my rational mind in a single, devastating blow. The dolls in the other room hadn't been looking at the camera lens, and they hadn't been looking directly at me through the walls. They had been looking at the massive, ancient, unblinking entity standing right behind me in the dark. The collection hadn't brought the terrifying haunting into my house, it had simply served as a physical, highly sensitive early warning system, reacting violently to the massive, highly predatory void that had quietly, effortlessly bypassed my heavy locks and attached itself directly to my isolated life. I sat completely frozen in the cold, pale blue light of the monitor, my entire body violently trembling as the raw, screaming, animalistic fear entirely consumed my fragile soul. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I simply stared in absolute, mind-numbing horror at the glowing screen, entirely aware that the heavy, freezing, localized drop in barometric pressure I had been feeling all morning was actively radiating from the pitch-black corner directly over my exposed shoulder right at this very moment. Not just dolls, something standing behind him. Living through such a profoundly disturbing true horror story actively strips away every single logical defense mechanism you possess, forcing you to accept that you are no longer the apex predator in your own secure environment, but merely trapped prey waiting in the dark. I violently ripped the power cord entirely out of the wall socket, plunging the monitor into absolute darkness, grabbed my heavy car keys, and blindly sprinted out of the sprawling craftsman house, entirely refusing to look back into the dark shadows of the hallway or the corners of my office. I hired a specialized estate liquidation company the very next day, completely refusing to step foot back inside the freezing property while the collection remained under my roof. I instructed them to remove everything. I got rid of every doll, every single piece of antique wood and fragile porcelain, desperately hoping to completely purge the heavy, toxic paranormal energy from my fractured life. I completely emptied the locked room, leaving absolutely nothing but bare, white walls and echoing, polished hardwood floors. I wanted the house to be completely sterile, devoid of anything that could possibly harbor that dark, ancient attachment. But some horrifying things are not tethered to physical, inanimate objects, and some ancient, unblinking entities do not simply leave your home just because you throw away their toys. I got rid of every doll, but every night at 3:14 a.m. I still hear something move.